I should welcome you all to the call. Thank you all for joining. If this is the first time you are on a call with, or one of these webinars with me, I should say, welcome. My name is Ashling and I'm a customer value manager here at Easygenerator. Today I have the pleasure of running the session or moderating the session. And I'm joined by two lovely guests who will introduce themselves in just a moment. Before we jump in, I do want to mention that the chat is here available to you. I know we're all introducing ourselves and where we're from. You can use this chat to ask questions, to share any insights, or even suggest topics that you'd like to see in future webinars as well. But without further ado, I am going to introduce the lovely gentlemen that I have with me today, Jon and Derek. Jon, your first time on my screen, so would you like to begin by introducing yourself?
Of course. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are from the world. I see we have a very international audience here. My name is Jon. I am the Global Customer and Capability Education Manager for Keune Haircosmetics. We are a Dutch cosmetics brand which exports our products to over 95 countries internationally. So naturally, when I got invited to join on this webinar, there are a lot of really interesting things that well, I hope I can share with you today. And of course, it's a core responsibility of my function and the function of my team. So fingers crossed, I share a bit of value with you in this session today.
Nice. Well, thank you. We're happy to have you. Derek, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Derek Bruce. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Easygenerator, joined in January of this year. And prior to that, spent a lot of time in Amsterdam, in Europe, in the US, in different organizations such as Signify, ABN AMRO, and DSM Firmenich in the Netherlands, doing L&D and leadership roles. So the whole concept of localization is very big in terms of working in very global organizations. So again, happy to share some ideas, insights, and thoughts on the topic as well.
Yeah. I'm really excited for today's conversation, especially because you both have had boots or have boots on the ground. So hopefully we can really, cement the conversation and what actually happens. To set the scene a little bit before we dive in, it is important to highlight that today we are talking about localization and why it should be more than just an afterthought. So training is still very often designed centrally, so usually in one language and then adapted later. So localization in this case becomes something that happens at the end of a process rather than being built in from the start. And that can cause a few challenges. It makes it harder to keep content consistent across different languages. Updates can become slower. And in many cases, what gets translated doesn't always fully reflect the local context, whether that's things like examples, terminologies, measurements, or ways of working. At the same time, expectations are changing. So learners in this modern world are expecting content to be relevant to their work, to the context that they're working in, and then also increasingly the language that they prefer. Ultimately, the goal isn't just to understand what we're trying to learn, it's also applying that new information and changing behavior. So conversations have really shifted. That's why we're here today. It's no longer about whether organizations should be localizing learning. Most already are or know that they should be. The question really in the past few years has shifted into how do we scale localization in a way that's fast, that's consistent, but also sustainable. So that's the idea. That's why we're here today and what this conversation will be about. As always, you can pop stuff in the chat. But taking a look at the reality of global learning today, maybe Jon, you can kick us off with your experience at Keune. We'd love to know, what does global learning actually look like in practice and where does localization fit into that?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So as a cosmetics brand, I want to go to the essence of what education actually is from our perspective and who do we actually service. And as a cosmetics brand, I always say this, our number one goal is to turn a 20 euro product into a 200 euro service. So it means that education is much more than just sharing product information. Now, our audience are hair professionals and also consumers. And also we have internal stakeholders as well, or internal teams that we collaborate with as well. So around 5-6 years ago, we launched our award-winning e-learning platform called the Keune Online Academy. There are a lot of things that we learn along the way. The platform, just to give you some context, we service now over 70 countries globally. The platform is available in 23 languages, and we currently have 13,700 users, with a projection of hitting around 15,000 users by the end of this year. So as you can imagine, with the audience, with the products, with the different educational levels across the globe, it is not an easy feat. So what is the reality at the moment? Well, if we go down to our core user, which is a hair professional, these individuals really love learning, and they learn off TikTok, they learn off YouTube. So they like short, snappy educational content. It's got to be inspiring, it's got to be creative, and it has to get into the action. For us, one of the real challenges that we faced was our bias, because we focus very heavily on really the content, the translation of the messaging from the laboratory, from the marketing, etc., to really make sure that we get the essence of the product's usage correct. And this has really been quite a large learning curve for us, because it's not only about making sure that the content we share is relevant and it meets the needs of our customers, but also it can be scalable across all of the countries that we service. So localization has two different faces for us, because we work very much with a blended learning principle. So it's really about what we offer online and what we offer offline, and how they both complement each other. And we see online learning really as a tool that works with our face-to-face education offering globally.
Okay, it's really interesting, and it's cool to see that, yeah, you really are scaling and you're in this process. So I'm really interested to hear, yeah, how that's gone and what perhaps comes next. Yeah, and then Derek, from your side, I know that you've had lots of experience with global enterprises. I'd be curious to know what role localization has played in the approach to learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things when I first started working, especially in ABN AMRO, which was a Dutch headquartered company with 17 locations outside, it wasn't a big thing. It was very much almost like the head office kind of determines the content and you just translate rather than localize, which are two very different things as well. And I think over the years, I've seen that it's much more around looking at how, as a strategy, you do that source of when you start looking at learning, whether it's going to be face-to-face, online, blending, whatever. It's kind of appreciating that all of the people in your organization of all different languages need to get the content in the right kind of way, the right language, right style, so they can make an impact as well. So strategically, we globally always said when we design stuff, how's this going to land not just in the Netherlands going forward, but in the US, in the UK, in France, in Germany. And I think that focus is very hard, especially if your HQ is kind of dominant as well. But it's very important, for one, to make sure whatever learning you do is impactful, but also to make sure that people outside of your HQ location also still be part of the organization. Because everything is just a variance and not localized properly, it creates that kind of, well, we don't really matter kind of piece as well. So I think strategically, we always looked at it, whatever we're looking at doing any kind of change or learning, it was one of the things which was also part of the design process as well.
That makes sense. So it's not just about, and I think just is even underselling it here, but it's not just about making the content more relatable or more effective for learners, but also making them feel like part of the organization and the culture as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Really interesting. So yeah, now that I think we've spoken a little bit about localization, I'd love to see, yeah, how that's happening and how structuring localization as a system and on a project works. Jon, you mentioned just a few minutes ago that you're scaling learning across 70 countries and 23 languages. What did it take for Keune to move on from those early challenges to a more structured localization model?
To be totally honest with you, a lot of trial and error. So in the beginning, we received the brief, guys, we need to reach more people. We definitely see that education is moving towards e-learning, learning on the go. course, this was really accelerated after the COVID period. So we really pulled everything forward to really accelerate this. And in the beginning, we jumped straight into it. So we knew what we needed. We knew what we wanted on the platform, but how you really spread that across all the territories, that was really quite a big challenge. So for us, it was really about creating a system or a process and taking our learnings from this and then building on those learnings. So back in the day, to give everyone context, the whole team were all trained hair professionals and then trained into the realm of education. So as you can imagine, we have extensive experience with offline learning, but online learning is a whole other ball game altogether. So how we have approached this is we divided up our department into teams. So we have the content creators that work with the other stakeholders. Then we have the digital team, and they are really responsible for making sure that each project is run from point to point with our teams of translators all across the globe. And it was not an easy process because, of course, you have a full onboarding program, the timeline, project management, etc. But there was a lot of trial and error to get to that point. And coming back to the point of personalization, it also threw up quite a few challenges along the road as well.
It makes sense, and I love the honesty as well. We're here to learn from each other, but it makes
Absolutely.
sense to
Yeah.
take what you're doing to launch what you're doing, and then
Yeah.
reflect on that, take the
I
lessons,
mean,
and
if I add to this, I mean, if you said to me, can we roll the clock back 5 years and start again? Yes, I would really map this out. I mean, I have a dear a colleague, Nancy. She's got a super analytical mind, and she really is amazing at taking a jigsaw piece and creating a structure out of that. And I think it really starts with a really clear, honest, transparent discussion at the very beginning, and really establishing a clear framework and system to really ensure that this is executed very well.
Yeah. So going in with the plan. Yeah. Derek, you also mentioned making content more relatable and part of the organization. So I'm curious, how does that change the way that you've approached localization at scale?
I think it's interesting because before I moved to EG, I was working for a company in the UK called Tesco, which sells beans and food and stuff like that. You may have heard of them. And we did some work with around 3,000 leaders around how they could lead inclusively, basically. But there were 3,000 leaders in the UK, in Slovakia, Slovenia, Poland, India, basically 5 or 6 different questions of locations, sorry. And I think one of the things we learned from the blueprint we have at Tesco, or had at Tesco, I should say, was to involve those learners in the design process, especially if you're looking at scale. So yes, we have a design team. We look at making sure the content is relevant and it's aimed towards making an impact and changing the behavior, but also having the people who are receiving it from different locales helps to also make us understand what's appropriate and what isn't, and having them in a review stage. So certain things, which is a really good example when you talk about inclusion, for example, there are certain phrases in the UK. There's a phrase called banter, BANTER, which if you're in the UK, you can't understand that banter isn't appropriate. Banter can, there's a connotation with it. That one word means nothing to anybody outside the UK, but it was within the context of our learning. So by having the different locales involved in review and design process, it was evident that that just doesn't make sense. How do you get a message across without using that word, but still make sense as well? So actually having the learners involved, having that co-creative kind of mindset and having the review process meant that when things were launched, and even if the languages were different or subtitled, whatever, you still meant the nuances were still captured. And I think that's the only way, especially if you're in a global company, where you can truly be inclusive, if you actually include people who are going to receive an end of the content as well.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially when it comes to something like translations, that direct translation doesn't always work.
Doesn't exist.
You're missing those pieces. Yeah, but that's really interesting. And then, John, I'm curious to kind of dig into the structure that you've landed on. as well. So you mentioned that, yeah, if you could go back, you might start differently, but you have come a long way and you have a process in place. So I'd be really curious to look like or to understand what that looks like day to day. You mentioned split work between
Yeah.
content creators and digital teams.
Yeah, indeed. So, of course, in the beginning, you start with a blank slate, right? So, okay, this is the platform. We've invested. Okay, let's go, baby. So, of course, we get going. And then what ends up happening is you maybe have one or two people that are developing everything. And this really is what happened at the beginning. And then sometimes you have a little bit of bias that's involved in this. So, piloting or testing is not quite that robust. If we look now, where we are now, it's a completely different setup. So where do we always begin? We always begin, just like with a marketing calendar, we set up a roadmap for the whole year. So what is it that needs to be updated or adjusted or introduced to our e-learning platform? As a cosmetics brand, everything that we do or our priorities are dictated by all the new products or updates or whatever that needs to come. So we have a roadmap developed within that, and it always starts with the content team, or the customer and capability team. So we will create all of the contents necessary for the modules. This is then tested with select countries. So we would take North America, we would take United Kingdom, Spain, we would go to Brazil. So we would test with some pilot countries. We will then refine that content, and then once this is done, and this is done in conjunction with the digital team, and once this is done, then it's effectively deployed out through the digital team to all of the territories, who will then make the necessary adjustments. And the digital team will be managing that timeline, and of course we in the background will be adjusting it where necessary, to ensure that it's really where it should be. So this is more or less how we work as a collective.
Yeah, but it makes a lot of sense.
Sorry to add to this, sorry, because it's a bit broad. It's not only about just doing a kickoff meeting and you deploy it. No, of course we have regular meetings. So of course once a week we have a kickoff, or we have a stand up where we really dive into any of the challenges that we are facing, any blockages within that process, and every quarter we also do the cycle. So we are always in a constant communication, and I think to sum this all up, it's really about working as a collective, communicating as a collective, and cultivating really a culture where everyone is fighting for the same team and for the same goal, making sure that the roles within the departments and the teams is super clear. And I think something that our digital team does extremely well is also ensuring that the teams globally, our education teams and translation teams, have all the tools and support that they need, so they are set up for success. So typically the digital team will meet the translators at least once per week, again to keep the project on track. As you can imagine, with the number of languages that we're working with, it can happen that sometimes things can drop off the radar.
Yeah. What's interesting there is like perhaps there's some differences, and I know that, yeah, it seems like you have a well-oiled machine and lots of collaboration to make things happen. But in both examples from yourself, Jon, and you, Derek, you mentioned getting the locations involved. So like you roll out to a few countries and then you take what you learn before you deploy it to all 23. Derek, I'd be really curious to know what needs to be in place to make the contribution from local teams and subject matter experts actually work in practice.
I think there's a number of almost like technical, but also human kind of aspects. I think the human aspects from a L&D team is trust, and trust that relationship you have with your colleagues in other locales. And going back to Jon's point, you're all fighting for the same purpose. And I think sometimes L&D, especially if you're a centralized, you're kind of in a head office, you sometimes have this we're better than mindset. I've never had it, but I've seen it. So I think it's important to have that trust that whatever you get from your colleagues in other locales is actually really valuable and actually does make sure that their people learn as well. I think the other thing in terms of structure is to make sure that there are mechanisms for iterations of the learning, and it's time. I think one of the worst things is to kind of go, here's our 99.9% finished content. you've got a week to make any changes. And they're like, well, hang on a second, this doesn't make sense. So I think in terms of making sure what's in place within a design process, have that space where you know you're going to have iterations, reviews, content, or contact with other people, whether it's business partners, learning designers, people who are in the L&D team, just to kind of make sure it makes sense. And I think the other thing that needs to be in place is time to run kind of those demo meetings as well, where you run people through things. I think you mentioned it as well, John. So when I did the work within Tesco with a partner and then with the different locations, there was probably 3 or 4 different pilot sessions run, face-to-face and virtual, in different places, different people attended, just to make sure that once a final product was done, it made sense to everybody as well. And I think that allowing that time to do that is one of the things which it's easy to forget, in terms of it's not the time to review, it's the time to make the changes and then review it again. And I think that needs to be kind of built in, as well as the trust that the people telling you the stuff is actually, what they're doing is going to make it much better as well. I think that for me is really important.
If I may, I just want to quickly add to this point, because this is a very good point. And this is, I think, something within that process, regularly checking and aligning, because again, as a cosmetics brand, we work with fact, so if, for example, if in we develop the module and we say product is used X, Y, and Z, of course, these rules are checked with regulatory, legal, etc., right? And so we also are very mindful that that is consistent globally, and that sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge. So trust is a huge part of this process. It really is. Yeah.
Then, I guess I'm a bit curious there as well. How do you balance that, consistency with also the localization piece? So like the need to make changes while also keeping these facts, in place.
Yeah, well, this can really be a challenge, and because of course we had to ask ourselves, indeed, how do we balance this? And how we see it is that the Keune Online Academy, or through our e-learning, we're able to use this as a scaling tool. So with one voice, and of course we make it as interactive as possible, taking the feedback from the different markets. But actually, most of the localization actually takes place on the ground in our face-to-face training. So this is why we see Keune Online Academy as a blended learning tool in collaboration with our offline training. So because you can only personalize to a point, right, as a cosmetics brand. So then personalization, really the face of personalization, is in terms of the variety of content that we're using on the platform to make sure that we're really hitting the needs of the hair professional. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also, a good practical example. I will say, for those of you following along in the chat, if localization is something that you're currently working on or you're trying to scale, today we are very much talking about like the strategy, the challenges, the wins. But we will also be hosting a webinar where we will focus more on the practicalities of how to make that work in Easygenerator or with translations, so including Easy Translate 2. If you're interested in joining that as well, if you want to see more of the practicality, not the practicalities, but the technicalities of how to make that happen, we're going to drop a link in the chat, so you're welcome to join that conversation as well, just in case you're scratching your head or you're eager to learn more on that point. But before I take us too far off course, Jon, you've mentioned something that I want to follow up on. You were describing a very structured process between the content team and the digital team. And I'm really curious, how does AI, or if AI plays a role and makes a difference in that workflow?
It plays a huge difference. I think the biggest difference, or the most impactful thing with AI is cost, of course, and time. For me, time is the biggest thing. And this is because, again, if I look at the audience, so if we're looking at hair professionals, they are super visual and super kinesthetic. They love to get into the action as quickly as possible. So before the days of AI, so we know, globally, video, short, snappy videos is the way to really hit the needs of our audience. If you blend that with gamification, some short activities, this really wins them over. Now, before AI, you would produce maybe videos, you would spend maybe 20 to 30,000 euros on videos. You get maybe 2 or 3 years out of them, and then you have to redo them, right? Because maybe you've had a rebrand or product information has changed. We partnered with an AI tool last year, a video creation tool last year. And well, when I ran the numbers, I almost fell off my chair because we spent in total 24,000 euros. We produced over 800 interactive videos, and it saved us around 800,000 euros as a brand. It was quite impressive. And the amazing thing about it is, again, you can localize, you can adjust, you can translate it. It's fabulous. One of the biggest challenges, though, we found with AI was finding the right tools, the tools that all complement each other, because, of course, Easygenerator has fantastic tools. And, of course, we pilot everything up front to see, okay, what really meets our needs as a brand. So I think, really researching, finding the appropriate tools for your needs is super important. However, the other thing is we also went through a phase of being over-reliant on it. And that also can be a danger. So I think now we've got to the sweet spot. But yes, I have to say, AI, it is a force of good when used in the best way,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, finding its place
Finding
in
the
the
sweet spot.
ecosystem, of course, yeah, where it
Yeah,
can act
exactly.
as a help
Exactly.
for sure.
Mhm.
And Derek, what about you? Have you found that
Yeah.
things change once AI becomes part of the workflow?
I think it does. I think it's for me, there's kind of 2 or 3 things which it made much easier, with a caveat, but you still need to have people to make sure and check what's going on as well. But I think in terms of a consistency of approach, it meant that we could use the same model for different languages, and ongoingly. So that kind of meant we weren't changing stuff, we weren't changing vendors, providers, etc. as well. I think one of the things which was really powerful is the speed and also the update. I think, as John mentioned, where you're not updating content every single time, because it allows you to make tweaks if things aren't right very, very quickly, very, very easily. I think one of the interesting things which we had also as a benefit, which I never realized, is we did an amazing video for another organization I worked for, and it was multilingual. And we realized that some of the voices we'd used when we watched the semi-final version were kind of showing individual biases. So like positive with certain voice, negative with certain voices. And the AI meant we could just tweak it really easily. It didn't mean going back to recording studio. It didn't mean going back in. It just meant literally going, okay, that voiceover can now be this, that can be this, that can be this, and it was done. And that was within a couple of hours. And I think that flexibility is really, really, really good. But I still think the thing which, even being part of a workflow, it still needs us as professionals to have that final kind of guardrail to make sure that it sounds right, it feels right, it sounds authentic, it comes across the right way. Because for some reason, we as humans can still kind of feel, if a voice is AI, if the translation's AI, if it's not quite the nuanced, it doesn't feel genuine. And I think that's the thing which I think we need to also be aware of in terms, not just for translation of the content, but if it's been used at the output end of learning as well, just how it comes across as well.
Yeah, that is something that we see quite commonly across customers, especially who are using the translation piece or Easy Translate, that they'll translate the courses. It's maybe 90% of the way there, but they'll do a few tweaks to the language to either make it sound more natural, or sometimes it is adding in like a colloquialism or like a branded term, that the tool might miss out on. Okay. Interesting. So AI definitely helpful, but we have to be wise with how we're doing it and not lose the human. I think if
definitely.
I've gathered that correctly. That's where we landed. So John, you did mention, the over-reliance on AI, and I'm curious how you decided where AI adds value and where you still need that human touch.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, one of the great things about AI is, of course, it's the efficiency, right? And but I think the challenge can be is that you know, every time you are asking AI to do something, it churns out a beautiful
Mm,
response, right? And every time you think, oh, this is amazing. I can't live without this. But then when you start to scratch beneath the surface and
mm,
you take a closer look at it, I think everything that you do with AI needs to have a human touch, because at the end of the day,
mm,
we're on the business of curating brain changes, right? And you do this through a human touch, especially as again with our audience with hair professionals, we are communicating. Yeah, and I think you tapped into the translation tool within the Easygenerator. It's a remarkable tool. However, within our industry, we have a lot of industry specific lingo. So you would
Mhm.
never just use a translation tool and leave as is. It has to always be checked by a professional, and not even by a translator. It really needs to be someone who can translate, but who is also within the industry, so they can really
mm,
curate it to the needs of the audience. So bottom
Mhm.
line is, all AI tools add value to some extent, but I think it's about looking at what the pros and the cons are, depending on what your needs are or what your
mm,
necessities are.
Mhm.
And there always has to be a human element to it. I mean, if I look at the video tool, for example, we
mm,
went to 3 or 4 different agencies, and it was a really interesting project. It was a very complex project because, you know, is it compliant with data
yeah,
regulations? How does this work with the buyout? How does it work with the library of voices? Because again, coming back to the point about the voices, even this can leave an impression. The avatars, to the
mm,
extent that you can edit, integration within Easygenerator, for example. So
Mhm.
there are many different things, and I think if you don't pilot, if you don't get
yeah,
perspectives from people that are going to be working with it and people that will be using or observing this, it can really cloud you, and I think it can be a very expensive mistake if you don't
mm,
get this right, you know.
Mhm.
yeah, definitely.
It makes a lot of sense, especially what you said. Piloting helps, doing the research helps. I know as well that if you are launching any AI tools, so for example, always making sure that you have the human check, but for also things like translation, building out your glossaries or seeing what's available to you
Mm,
Yeah.
to make to make it as smooth as possible in the first instance. So when a human comes in, they hopefully have to do less cleanup, let's say.
mm.
Um,
Exactly.
and it looks like, that you've really built out that AI framework and how you use AI. And I'm curious, John, if that's having any impact on the expectations of stakeholders.
That's a great question. So the challenge can also be is that the beauty of AI is that you can do everything much quicker, right?
Mm,
However, if we're talking in the environment of stakeholders, I think even within the realm of education, I think unless you're really in it, sometimes we think that AI is really like the wand of Harry Potter. You know, you just
mm,
click and you get the result and it's ready to go. And I think if we're talking about stakeholders, first you need to first justify the cost and
Mhm.
okay, what am I going to get in return of the cost, or what is my return on investment, and then really secondly also setting the expectations for them, you know, that okay, it is a great tool, it does this, but we also really need time to add that human touch, to do those changes or to adjust it so it is following our brand voice or our verbiage or our glossary, you know. So, and that I have to say, if we're talking about the video creation tool, is a perfect example. I would say 50% of the challenge I had was really getting buy-in from stakeholders,
mm,
first for the investment,
Mhm.
but also the expectations of what AI can do. You know, even something as simple as how real should the avatar look? Should
mm.
it be really obvious as an avatar? Should it be should it be super lifelike? All of these kind of things, I think, were quite a challenge with AI, and it is something that I underestimated when I
Mm,
started exploring this world.
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah, so many things that we can put on there. Derek, I'm really curious as well from your experience. Have you also seen expectations from the business that AI makes things faster and more flexible?
I think the expectations have been kind of this, it's been interesting in the sense of there's been, I think, as John mentioned, the expectation that it's got to be an ROI, an ROE, return on engagement of what you do and how you do it. An expectation that it should be quicker to market because it's now not being outsourced, it's now being done in-house. But I think the balance between that is also the expectation that it should still feel human and it should still feel right. And I think that is unrealistic in some aspects. And Jon's point around the avatars, the voices, look and feel, if you get a voice or you get somebody who does translation with a real voice person, AI voice, there are nuances which people, as mentioned before, people do get. So I think the expectations have shifted. Not always realistic, though. I think that's the thing. And I think one of the things with AI collectively is we do have expectations of that it kind of can do everything, and it can't. We get expectations that the L&D team, L&D function can do more with less, also unrealistic. Because if you don't have those guardrails, it doesn't work as well. So I think one of the things I found when we started using AI in terms of expectations is also there's a big need for me to manage those expectations better and have the conversations with people outside of L&D, with the finance guys, with the IT guys as well, in terms of can it just be plug and play versus those integrations needed, for example? Where's it stored and how does that make sure that it's not breaking any of our data privacy stuff, for example, as well? So I think outside of the product itself, there's also lots of conversations around the integration of whatever platform, process, software you use and how that works as well, which I think is something which we as only professionals need to be also be aware of, but it's not just the outcome, it's stuff around it as well, which is important to manage expectations as well.
Yeah, I think that can get overlooked in the shuffle. That AI is time saving. It can do all these great things, but also to even get it, into people's hands, let's say, as a tool, then some work has to be done there on the back end too. With the IT, I also think education, perhaps sometimes when it comes to AI, is also important, like what it can do, how you can use it.
Also, what it can't do, I think that's the thing as well. What certain things it can't do and it just can't do because it's just not that sophisticated. And I think the elements around it's great. And I think I hate to admit that the phrase co-pilot, which is another brand, obviously, but actually that's probably the best definition of AI. It's not going to do it all. It is actually your co-pilot. It helps you do stuff well. It doesn't do the stuff for you. And I think for me, it's always going to be human first, AI second, in whatever guise we do it as well.
I would love to just add to this actually, because when I think back to the beginning, I remember us creating a pilot video, and it really did get to the point when we were doing the feedback rounds with stakeholders. I want the avatar. They need to move like this, and I need to see more of this. And I don't like how the avatar says this, and and I got to the point I really had to sit down with this individual and say, with respect. Is now taking so long to try and do these impossible things. Maybe it's actually easier to hire a production company and just do this externally, which actually defeats the whole point of using AI. So, and that really is a huge challenge. I want to lean back into to what you were just saying, Derek, about managing expectations. This, when we're talking about getting the project going, this was the hardest thing, really managing the expectations. And if I think about it, people are very visual. Show them a beautiful video, tell them what they need to invest, tell them what they think they can get in return. As long as you have the numbers, everyone's happy.
So would that be the advice for anyone tuning in today? Show them the numbers and what they can expect. Okay. Well, there, you've heard it. I'm sure that will come up. We will be having a bit of a Q&A in a few minutes. So if there are any burning questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. But also, if you have any insights or examples, takeaways that you'd like to share for us to learn collectively, you can pop them in there too. In the meantime, I'd kind of like to take a few minutes to look at what scaling globally will look like moving forward. Derek, I know that we've kind of touched on this, but based on everything we've discussed today, what do you think scalable global learning looks like in practice moving forward?
I think for me, there's a couple of things in terms of how it works and how it looks. I think one of the things is having the right ecosystem with support working in a global way. in terms of technology, but also in terms of processes and people, because you need to be flexible, you need to be quick, you need to be consistent. And I think the ecosystem underneath that, in terms of technology, people, processes, is what allows the scaling to happen as well. I mentioned up front the importance of people in different locales, and I think that is essential going forward as well, in terms of them knowing better the nuances, what's going to work, them knowing the languages, and how it's been translated. But also, if you think about it, I think you mentioned TikTok and all the other different social platforms. Everybody who goes onto one of those does it in their mother tongue. They don't do it in English. They do it in a tongue they want to do it in. You know, if you now go onto Netflix, for example, one of the biggest or actually two of the biggest shows recently, one was Korean, and then it's like people are more open also to different languages, but I think people want to have stuff which is in their own mother tongue. So I think that the SMEs being able to be involved at the point of starting stuff is really important, not at the end where you haven't got enough time as well. And I think the last thing is it's also the relevance. You know, it's if you just translate stuff using a bog standard translation machine and it just does A to B and banter becomes a different word in French and German and Spanish and what have you, it doesn't have any value. And I think all of our roles when it comes to L&D, leadership development, learning, it's around making sure whatever people get touched on by the stuff we produce, it has an impact positively, it changes behavior and it makes them do stuff better. If it can't do that because it's not right, they can't understand it, we failed at our roles as well. So I think for me, they're the key things we need to do to make sure it's scalable as well.
Okay. So it's taking notes. So if I've gathered this correctly, it's making sure that we have the ecosystem in place, which is really important. Getting individuals in the locales involved, and not just at the end, but also at the beginning. And then if you take a look at the bigger picture, keeping that in mind, that whatever we create needs to be effective in driving change for the individuals taking the training.
And hence a company as well.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then, I'd be curious, Jon, based on your experience so far, how do you see localization evolving at Keune in the next few years?
Yeah, so for us, I think personalization is going to become much more of a key topic area and a tailor-made pathway. So at the moment within our own e-learning platform, we have specific pathways which are developed from a global level. But indeed, I think bringing in different territories earlier into that process, meaning that the content is much more engineered to what the local teams are expecting to see, you know, and it's also even making sure that the variety of content that we have on the platform keeps them engaged and again is relevant to the local audience, because as you can imagine, one point of truth always remains the same: the product information, right? And our job is, you know, how do we measure success? As a cosmetics brand, we measure success by activity that happens offline afterwards. So driving our customers to offline academy seminars and of course purchasing more products and staying within the cycle of the brand. So there's also the commerciality that sits within this. And how do we see this going forward? Really personalization based on the needs territorially within the territory, but even for the user. And I think that will be the pathway that we are taking.
That makes sense. But again, it makes sense, but you have a clear roadmap. I know now of what you're trying to achieve, a way to measure that, and you're taking steps in that direction.
Yeah, indeed. And I think you know, for us, I think as you can imagine, we're in 95 countries worldwide. So we are looking to expand the platform to more territories, more languages, which is a great task, I will say. So I look like this. And then at the same time, we're also looking to, you know, enhance and improve that. And we're doing that following the marketing timeline. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of balls in the air. But the ultimate goal, personalization will be the key. That this is absolutely our future.
It's definitely an exciting time. And you said something very interesting there, which I think will segue us nicely to the question and answer portion of today's call. I saw a question come in from Sabrina about how many languages should they realistically start with when it comes to scaling localization. And Jon, now that you're touching on this and expanding the learning, I'd be curious, if you could provide some insights.
Yeah, well, this is a great question for which I wasn't so involved with this project from the very beginning. What I would say to you is I would pick maybe 3 or 4 key languages and think strategically about this. So don't pick I don't know, 10 or 12 languages. And I think develop a process to introduce this gradually. So, I know in the beginning we started off, of course, with English, German, French and Spanish. I think it was like 3 or 4 languages in the beginning. And then the year after, we introduced another 2 or 3 more languages. So don't try and do everything at once. And I think really have a roadmap in place and think strategically about this.
Yeah, I think that's quite a common approach from working with the clients. It's typically what they'll do. They'll start with a few core languages, whatever languages it is that they have either the largest audience or the most influential. They'll start and they'll do a few practices to really figure out what that flow will look like, or what the review process looks like, or how much information do we need to give to the translators or whoever's reviewing the translation. And then once they have that, they can start to scale. So
yeah, indeed. I
quite
really
similar.
think strategically. I think that is really our number one learning. Really have a clear roadmap. I think the better you plan and map this out, the stronger the deployment will be.
Yeah. And I think that makes perfect sense, especially because it's always easy to kind of want to do too much too soon, and then you realize you've got everything wrong. So I think it's definitely kind of like work out the biggest headcount, work out really where it's going to have the biggest impact. Also involve those people in it as well. And actually, once you've kind of got that and you know things work, then you can start kind of evolving it as well.
Makes sense. So involving the locals. Maybe if you also have some projects that like either are getting some notice or some eyes on them, it can be nice to use them as the test as well. I see that there's another question actually from Sabrina about how long did it take to build that structured localization process at Keune? And they find that localization costs are quite high due to using external providers.
Yeah, this is a great point. So let's start first with the duration. It was really a process. So as I said, when we first started with this project, we really jumped directly into it, and I would say the first year, we actually did a pilot with our subsidiaries. And of course, with our subsidiaries, we have more space, so we were working, of course, internally with the team. I would say that localization process, I think from really getting that language up and running was anywhere between 6 months to 6 to 8 months. So really going from point to point. In terms of the cost, well, yeah, this is a really good point. So with us, we have a framework because with our model, we work with subsidiaries and distributors globally. So we have an agreement already in place. So we manage and we are responsible for everything centrally. But when it comes to the localization, this is done on the account of the country that is doing the localizations. And we have agreements in place for this. So we develop everything centrally. And then we work along from that point.
Yeah, it makes sense when you lay it out. That's really something that's structured and can evolve over time.
I do want to add one thing though, because about the cost, because this was also a very costly mistake. What did a lot of people do? Sorry, I have to laugh because it's so what they did was they sent everything to a translation agency. Oh, I don't have the resources, etc. And what happened? Well, of course, when the translations came back, those translations lacked the precision because, of course, we go back to the word like lingo. It's these kind of nuggets, these local nuggets. So for us, the key was also working with our local education teams, and in each country we have an assigned person from the education department who is doing the translation sometimes if their competency is high enough, or in conjunction with a translator, but they make sure that everything is adjusted and adapted as needed to the local context.
And I think is that we had the same, I think when I was at ABM, we had the same protocol, which we then kind of thought it's a bit strange one because we do similar to your bureau, comes back someone locally, whether it's in Brazil, the US, France, Germany, they check it. And you're thinking, so we're duplicating the work as well. So how do we also make that smart? Because actually it's translated and it's double checked again. And we didn't really, I think AI helped to kind of reduce the time to check, but there was a lot of duplication of human effort from bureaus as well. Plus the fact you're paying them to translate it as well. So yeah, we had that challenge as well. Yeah.
That is interesting. I know we're speaking about external translators, which of course have their place. If it is something that you're looking to scale, if you are using Easygenerator, the translation tool might be helpful, only because, yeah, you can have everything translated
In
then
one
in
place.
one go and have
Yeah.
somebody come in and check that for you. So it becomes, one of the tools that becomes actually more cost effective as you use it. Each translation becomes cheaper, so it's something to consider. I also see Callum here in the chat as well, and I think Derek, you might be able to help out. How do you train your internal teams or subject matter experts to contribute to localized content?
I'm trying to think. So is that in a context of the content being appropriate for learning, or is that in a context of, I'm trying to work out. I mean, if I think of what I think you mean, I think making sure the content, even if it's localized, is still appropriate, goes back to the partnership and working with the subject matter experts of original content. So the learning team, the design team, the partners you've got designing the learning as well. So I think it's very much around explaining the nuances of the aim of what the learning's about, what the session's about, what the outcome should be. And if I think, for example, I had an example with SMEs in Eastern Europe, and we spent, myself and a partner, literally probably half a day just talking through why this training was going to do what it's going to do, how it needed to do it, how it needed to land, to make sure they understood not the kind of a language bit, but actually the nuance of what it meant to do. So they could then contextualize, okay, what this needs to do from my side as well. An interesting thing, having those really rich conversations, was culturally some stuff which we thought would work globally wouldn't work in their region. So we tweaked it according to that as well. So I don't know if the word train is the right word, if it's in a sense of the design outcome. Maybe it's collaborate with or actually work with is maybe the right word to get localized content, because train might imply that we get them to do what we want to do anyway, when in fact sometimes it may not work. So I don't know if that answers your question at all or not, Callum, but I think for me it's still a collaboration bit, it's still the kind of co-creating, it's still making sure I understand what you're trying to do, and then making sure that it's localized and personalized to that region or locale, and it hits the mark. Don't you want to add anything to that, John?
No, I don't think so. I think I think in the grand scheme of things, indeed, I think it's really all about it's all about collaboration. I was just thinking, if I could sum everything up, it's really about collaboration and communication, you know, and I think sometimes in education we have quite rigid, we can kind of be a little bit rigid in our thinking, you know, and I think sometimes it's those little snackies, you know, those mind snacks, you know, that really kind of unlock different approaches and different perspectives, you know. So yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, collaboration is a great word. I would have probably used enablement, but I think I'll move forward with collaboration. From working with a lot of different organizations, different sizes, from like really small, like under 20 people, to really big global enterprises. What I've noticed as well is that those conversations that you mentioned, Derek, are really important. They're really key. But also having some resources that those SMEs can rely on. So it could be something like a very quick checklist, like make sure that, I don't know, our content is branded. Did you does the language make sense? Do the examples make sense? Do the measurements that are used make sense? And you can make a much more detailed checklist. I know that if you're working with your customer success manager at Easygenerator, they have some examples that you can rely on as well. But also providing that kind of insight or resource that somebody can refer back to when they are doing the task can be really beneficial.
And I think just to add, sorry, but I didn't mention it because I think when I worked before, we had that kind of as a blueprint anyway. So kind of those things in terms of look and feel, tone of voice, how it should come across, were all kind of defaults, but it's completely right to highlight that. It's not just the conversations, it's also the guardrails to make sure that what they do actually also makes sense as well.
Yeah. So a lot of things that you can do, and I think there's a lot of cool points that I'm also going to take away from today and reflect on. I do see an insight from Florian as well that I thought was interesting about the workflow of publishing in LMS platforms like SAP SuccessFactors. So any like good practices, deployments, updates, maintenance. Do you have any suggestions about how to manage training that's localized, but then also deploying that to learners?
Big question.
Yes.
My 2 cents would be have good governance of what's going where, understanding who owns the content as well, and having that link between ownership and updates, having a process where if you think something is up, it needs updating, the individual who owns it is being made aware of it. And then obviously only goes to relevant people. I think that's one of the nice things about some of the LMSs and LXPs is you can just make sure it goes to the right people as well, and actually see the impact as well. That's top of my head, I would say.
I think it's a good example. I'm not sure, John, if you have anything to jump in with. I know if you're talking technically, there are some updates when it comes to e-learning in Easygenerator more specifically. So if it's possible, use an integration. But if you are publishing, you can use something like dynamic SCORM. So you don't have to re-upload content every time, let's say, somebody notices a word that needs changing. So that's perhaps something to the maintenance side of things. Okay, I think that's all the questions. I'm trying to have a quick run through. I know Romana asked a question about in smaller organizations where resources are limited and job roles are more rigid, it can make collaboration difficult. Is there any practical starting points that we would recommend? That could be our last question for today.
One thing I would say is if it's a smaller company and it's not someone's role, but you still need your expertise, try and work out how to make sure they're recognized and engaged with being involved. I think lots of people are happy to share, especially them as SMEs, if there's something in it for them. And I think maybe working out what it is that's in it for them in terms of whether it's recognition, reward, whatever, I don't know, to kind of be involved might be a starting point. And actually, even if it's just, time to say, it's making it easy for them, maybe is also another way of doing that.
I would say so. Yeah, if we're talking about Easygenerator more specifically, I would say rely on something like the translation tool for the first step.
Right,
Then find whoever, your SME heroes would be who could help you, and then tap into what Derek would say, and make sure that they're incentivized to help out, whether it's recognition or reward, and making the process as simple as possible, but also finding the right people can really help. That looks like it for today's session. I know we're just running up on the time. If you are interested in more of those technical pieces about how do we make this work within the context of e-learning and an e-learning tool, feel free to sign up for the next session. I know that the link is in the chat. After we leave the stage, I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes as well in case there are any last minute questions. Before we wrap up, John, Derek, any last minute words or like key takeaways that you would leave?
Collaborate, communicate, and cultivate. They're my 3 C's. No, but really, I think looking from the top down, I really think that these are really the 3 words. You have to live it and breathe it. I mean, it's so important. And coming back to Derek, what's in it for them? Especially if you're collaborating with people, what's in it for them? You have to know that answer.
It's true. It's true.
And I think for me, just very simply, AI is a tool. It's not the answer all the time. So use
Exactly.
it wisely.
It's a good, yeah, an assistant rather than a yeah, a co-worker. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both for your time today, and thank you everyone who joined.